Yeah, okay. Guy makes one video about Catholic affairs, it blows up, and now he's running it back. This isn't my own vanity. I have something else I want to talk about, but for 2 days now, I haven't been able to find the proper words for it, so this just hit me when I was washing dishes, and it's all there, so we're going to talk about it. How shall we define our lives? What should be the sort of guiding cognitive principle? What should be on the forefront of our mind as we walk this earth every day, striving after God, seeking to serve our Lord Jesus and seeking to love him to the best of our capabilities? You can approach this thinking of the correct theological answers, right? Divine charity, love for God and love for our fellow man, right? Rounding out the theological virtues, thinking of hope in the things to come, in salvation and redemption, and faith, belief in God and his providence, and trusting and surrendering to him. But I'm not really talking about those. I'm thinking in more pragmatic terms, I guess. And you can hear that and you can say, okay, corporeal and spiritual works of mercy, right? Feeding the poor, clothing the naked, instructing the ignorant, things like that. But that's not really what I'm getting at either. I guess first and foremost is I'm thinking in terms of lived experience. What should be on our mind constantly as we wander this earth day to day, seeking to serve Jesus Christ? For me, it always comes back to sin, right? No matter how hard I try or how good I do for a certain period of time, everything just circles back to a fixation on sin and doing some things and not doing others based on divine moral guidelines. I look into the tradition of the Catholic faith and I find a disheartening amount of agreement with that sentiment. I find that the lived experience of the Church for 2,000 years, maybe up until the past 50 to 60, has been just a fixation on sin. And I think this obviously reaches its height in somewhere from the High Middle Ages to about the 1800s, right? Basically, scholasticism through manualism. In both of those periods, there's this intense rigor and attention to detail given to moral questions, researching of moral questions, and theological debate over moral questions. The majority of the theology that exists within the church is casuistic, and there's obvious reasons for that, right? We're moral creatures, we have agency, and so how are we not going to attempt to morally guide one another? I'm not necessarily saying this is wrong, it's just confusing. Obviously, Jesus Christ in the Gospels makes very strong claims about sin. God in the Old Testament makes very strong claims about sin, right? But even then, I feel like there's still a lot missing. One thing I will say is that there's this, I think it is a genuine misconception that people think the Old Testament is somehow harsher than the New, right? I find myself taking more comfort in Old Testament, in these very detailed stories and the romanticism that kind of comes out of it, right? I mean, I read earlier this year a lot of First Samuel, and David and Jonathan and Saul. More recently, I've been reading some stories from Genesis and reading the binding of Isaac and all of that. And I think it's just the nature of the two testaments, right? Majority of the New Testament exists explicitly for instructing people on how to live their life, right? In a very, very direct manner. One that's more direct than the verbose stories of the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, it's analogy, it's theme, its central message of a described happening. In the New Testament, at least in the epistles and the letters, it's do this and don't do this. And in the gospel, yes, there's the miracles of Jesus, but Other than that, it's him saying, do this, don't do this. So, I mean, when you stand back, you look at the Bible and you look at the long tradition of the church and the teaching of the magisterium and things like that. It's just all sin. And there is a part of that that reflects back on me. What peace, what agreements have I made with sin that make me so uncomfortable with this attempted all-out war against sin that's so significant in, again, the Bible, tradition, everything else. And that's a hard question to ask, but again, to think about it a little more, and I'm the one with the lived experience, right? Hyperfixating on sin the way I have at certain periods over the last 3 years, it's not been really productive at all. I just don't know. Everything always comes back to sin, right? I don't see what the idea of intimacy does for you other than its efficacy in relation to avoiding sin. I don't know what charity or love or any of these things, I don't know what that even entails other than how it relates to sin. I don't know what anything in the faith is really about unless we're interpreting it from the lens of sin and its impact on that, whether it makes you sin more or makes you sin less. And that's kind of it's a really stressful perspective to maintain. It's everything is useless if it's not helping you sin less. More often than not, everything that is useful, it can only be understood in the context of just sinning less. You sin less, therefore something good is happening. Some virtue has been granted to you. Some grace has been granted to you. Not some grace has been granted to me, therefore I sin less. You can never conceive of it that way. I can't conceive of it that way. And I wonder why that is. Everything is in reference to sin. Sometimes it's the only motivation I have. It's the only way I can motivate other people. And I don't really understand other people's realities. I guess I'm just asking, what's the most optimal thing to do? I've only lived one reality. I don't know what it's like to peer into the mind of all my Catholic friends who, at least on the surface, would seem to have much healthier and much more intimate relationships with God. I will say the perception often mismatches reality, but at the same time, I recognize specific individuals who I've known for 2 years who have progressed and gotten significantly holier in that time. They've and objectively have made more progress at this whole thing than I have. And that's a bitter realization, but it's something that I've swallowed, something that I've dealt with. I can accept it. I just don't really know. I don't know what perspective I'm supposed to be attacking this from. Everything seems to all come back to sin. And I didn't really articulate that well, but I tried my best.